Test.
Got it. Okay. Afternoon seminar that is all good. So it's my privilege to welcome Janine McManus as our seminar speaker today. She completed her Bachelor of Science at the University of British Columbia and her Master of Environmental Science from the University of Toronto. While finishing her master's degree, as we heard today, she volunteered for a winter waterfowl survey and was bit by the birding bug. So she switched gears and has now spent the past 10 years working in avian research. Most of her work has focused on large-scale monitoring using bioacoustics and wildlife telemetry to support conservation planning. Since 2022, she's had her job as a wildlife biologist at Environment and Conservation Canada, where she specializes in birds. So before I turn it over to Janine, just be aware the seminar will be recorded today. So if you miss something, you can't write it down fast enough. It'll be uploaded on YouTube once I get that going. And then also I wanted to acknowledge that we are here in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. So with that, go ahead, Janine, and then we will take all questions at the end. So let's give it up.
Thanks, Cassidy, for the introduction and for inviting me to come to the seminar today. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you all about a program that I work for that's very near and dear to my heart. It's the Grassland Bird Monitoring Program at the Canadian Wildlife Service. So my goal today is, it is on, does it not sound? Okay, it's good, okay. So my goal today is to give you an overview of the Grassland program, a little bit of a history of its evolution, and some of the data that we collect in-house. But then I want to narrow in on a few specific projects that we have going on that leverages not only our data, but other large external long-term data sets to help move the needle on grassland bird conservation. And I hope that it might spark the seed, especially with so many students in the room, that most of the data that I'm going to be talking about today is either publicly available right now or could be available upon request. So these are really large, amazing data sets that are definitely underutilized and could be used to answer kind of a suite of different questions. So let's get into it. Let's not get it.
I might just have to click back on here. Okay, now try. There we go.
Excellent, thanks. All right, so the Grassland Bird Monitoring Program at CWS, what is our mandate? So we are responsible for all breeding migratory land birds within Bird Conservation Region 11. And we are responsible for providing status and trend information for these species, as well as producing data products that can support conservation of land birds throughout the Central Great Plains. And why is our program called the Grassland Bird Monitoring Program? And it's not just because Bird Conservation Region 11 Monitoring Program doesn't roll off the tongue, but it's because our grassland birds out of the suite of species that nest or breed within Bird Conservation Region 11 are under kind of the biggest pressure, the most threats. We've seen the most dramatic declines in our grassland birds. So this is a pretty common figure that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, where we can see that birds that fall into the grassland habitat category have been experiencing the steepest declines since the 1970s. And it has some of the highest proportion of species that are experiencing severe declines. And so that's why our program was set up to focus on those grassland specialists in particular, even though we do collect data and model for all species that we encounter within region BCR 11, which is outlined in that kind of dashed line that circles the map here. So I want to give a little bit of history to the program. So the backbone of our monitoring data in the prairies is the breeding bird survey. And so those routes are all these black squiggly lines. This program was set up in the 1970s and has primarily volunteer surveyors out every year running the same route year after year. But in the early 90s, Brenda Dale, who kind of started the Grassland Bird Monitoring Program as it kind of is today, ran a few analyses that showed that the original draw of BBS routes were underrepresenting grassland habitat in our three provinces, prairie provinces. And so what Brenda did was to try to fill some of these gaps with new BBS routes. So this took a long time. It's a North American-wide program, so you can't just add new BBS routes because you want. So she did a lot of work to incorporate a series of new routes, they're highlighted in red there, that tried to fill some of those gaps. But you can already kind of see from this map where the darker brown is grassland cover and the pale beige is crop, that you can already notice that there's potentially some holes in this plan. So what Brenda did is she started a pilot doing off-road grassland bird monitoring in Suffield, in the Suffield National Wildlife Area, which is in this chunk of grass there. And so as Brenda was retiring, and Barry Robinson, who now leads the Grassland Bird Monitoring Program, kind of took the reins about 10 years ago. He, along with our collaborator, Nancy Mahoney from Science and Technology Branch, used the about 900 point counts or so from the Suffield National Wildlife Area to compare trend differences using those three different data sources. So the original BBS routes only, the original grassland bird monitoring routes, those are the BBS style routes, but they were added to fill some of the grassland gaps, and then the Suffield data. And what they found was that for a number of species, we can see significantly different trend results. So for chestnut-collared longspur, as an example, the BBS and even the additional grassland BBS routes show a negative trend, whereas the Suffield trend confidence intervals around 0 look to be about stable. Savannah sparrow, on the other hand, showed a strong positive trend, whereas BBS showed a slight negative trend. So we started to see some differences here. And it highlighted to Barry that our regional trends aren't necessarily going to be representative of some of these large remaining tracts of grassland. And we're not currently collecting enough data to estimate status and trend within these large blocks of grass that roads don't pass through. We also know from other research from Steve Davis and Nicola Coper's labs that a number of our grassland specialists are shown avoidance to roads and trails. And so a roadside survey may not be the most appropriate method to monitor some of those species for reasons that they're avoiding. They're going to be set further back from where the observer is standing. So that leads us into kind of a new selection of sites where we We estimated distance from road and created polygons for all the areas above a certain threshold, and then took a stratified random selection of those blocks of off-road areas to choose as long-term off-road monitoring sites to add to the Grassland Bird Monitoring Program. So in gray are sites that we have surveyed in the last 8 years, and red are other potential polygons that will be surveyed in the coming years. And so that kind of takes us to where the Grassland Bird Monitoring Program is today. So we're interested in kind of 3 main objectives with our program. So we are monitoring population status and trends using both on-road and off-road monitoring. We want to create species density models, range-wide species density models for all breeding land bird species in the Canadian prairies. And a new component just added in the last couple of years is that we want to add a migratory connectivity piece in conjunction with partners in the US to look at how conservation areas may be connected throughout the full annual cycle. And so we're collecting and compiling different types of data to kind of achieve these goals. And so the first is we're collecting a lot of count data, and we're doing a lot of in-person surveys, but we also use ARUs, or autonomous recording units, at some of our sites. And we work with partners to incorporate their ARU data into some of our trends and species models. We're also pulling a lot from remote sensing databases to create spatial covariates that span the entire Central Great Plains so that we can use our models to predict range-wide. And lastly, to address questions around migratory connectivity, we're using the Motus wildlife tracking network, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the very end. All right, so for our count data, starting there, what's our monitoring design? So for our off-road part of our program. So we've identified these large blocks of off-road habitat, and we grid out the site using section grids, which is the kind of legal land description. Is how land is described and bought and sold on the prairies. Because our method follows quite closely to a large program in the US, the Integrated Monitoring for Bird Conservation Regions, but our scale is just slightly different. Whereas they use 1 kilometer square cells, we're using 1.6 kilometer square cells. And so we take a spatially balanced random sample within the site, and then within each selected sample, we do 16 subsamples or point counts. So we're doing 16 point counts in a morning if we're doing an in-person survey, and then if we're using ARUs, we do fewer. So we do every other point gets an ARU if the section is being monitored with acoustics. And then we're aiming to revisit sites every 3 to 4 years. Of course, there was a bit of a pause during the pandemic. And so it's now about 5 or 6 years that we're revisiting, but and some sites are visited more frequently than that, especially if they're partner sites that are interested in data yearly or more frequently than what we're able to go and revisit. And for all point counts that are done in person, we're collecting 2 additional pieces of information. We're collecting the time of first detection. So when you detect an individual bird, we're recording which minute interval it was detected in, and we're collecting distance information. We use rangefinders and do a lot of practice, even though humans are notoriously bad at knowing how far a bird is away from them. But we do our best, and we kind of carry that through into some of the modeling in this ways how we can integrate data together. So altogether, the data that we're pulling together, we have the BBS, we have our GBMP data that CWS collects. Birds Canada has adopted the same sampling methodology for their grassland program. And they're out collecting thousands of point counts each summer as part of their program. Most of it is also open and available. And then we also integrate the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies program, which is the IMBCR, the Integrated Monitoring for Bird Conservation Regions. So all in all, we're looking at around 470,000 point counts in this conglomeration. And so we have a lot of point count data, and nearly all of it is publicly available. IMBCRs, you need to request that data set, but yeah, so we've got a lot of point counts to work with. So how are we applying that data? So the one aspect that I won't talk about much today, because we're entering the 10th year of the program, which means we have enough site revisits to start doing the trend estimates on our off-road sites and comparing them to BBS data. We're also working on an analysis to jointly integrate BBS and our off-road monitoring together into a single trend estimate. And so that's in the works, comparing trends inside and outside of these large intact grasslands, and also how we can improve the precision of trend estimates for grassland birds with the addition of the off-road monitoring, and what species it might improve the precision. And so what I want to get into today, though, is what we've been working on with the data in the meantime, while we get enough to dig into the trends, and that's creating these species distribution models. So this is the model for chestnut-colored longspur, the range-wide model. And so we're using boosted regression trees, which is a type of machine learning that has a particularly good ability for predictive performance, which is kind of the main driver of these models. We want to be able to predict range-wide. So that was the reason for choosing BRTs as our method. They're also, boosted regression trees are also able to handle a large set of covariates, especially when some of those covariates might be correlated. And so we include a series of things, including topography, weather, land use, and some multispectral imagery as covariates into these models. And so far we have range-wide for our Canada-only models, which was the first generation of this process. I think we have, as many species as we have data for, around like 64 models, and that are also publicly available and ready for anyone to use. But for the range-wide models, they do take a really long time to run, and this is their first iteration. We have 32 species run, but we have enough data to do 334 across the entire Central Great Plains. So that's just computer time at the moment. There's always some running somewhere. Yeah. Okay, so we have all this data, we've made some models, and we have some pretty maps. But how can we use that to really make an impact or inform where we direct some of our conservation dollars and resources? And so one project, and this is a manuscript that Barry and I are getting out the door this winter, is using a software called Zonation to pull all of our species density models and use this software, which gives us a relative priority of the importance of a given pixel for biodiversity for the region of interest as a whole. And so we're standardizing the density models to be between 0 and 1. They're overlaid, and then there's a whole series of zonation parameters, which we won't get into today. But it lets you kind of pick and choose different thresholds and how biodiversity will be treated, whether you're including abundance or species richness, add weights to species at risk. And then it generates this map. And so pixels that are in red are really high priority in terms of the amount of biodiversity kind of is protected or contained within that given zone across the region as a whole. And you can see that kind of unsurprisingly for our grassland birds, which we do use all the species we had models for across BCR 11, but grassland birds, any species at risk, which there are many that are grassland specialists, were weighted more heavily, which gives you this map of, that looks quite similar to the map of the brown patches in that kind of first couple slides. So those remaining areas of intact grasslands are extremely important for a whole suite of grassland bird species. And this is being directly used in the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture management plans. They're all bird planning. They're using the zonation results from our work to identify additional locations for conservation action. We're also looking at the co-benefit of waterfowl target landscapes. So for the last couple of decades, Prairie Habitat Joint Venture has created these target landscapes that are very important for waterfowl, and we're looking at kind of the co-benefit or the overlap with our high priority grassland areas and quantifying that relationship, which because northern pintail is a duck that needs a lot of upland habitat, there's actually more overlap than you would think at first, with all the wetlands being kind of in the blue. So that's one way that those are getting used. The second way that we're kind of identifying high priority grasslands and supporting partners who are looking to target resources at specific patches of grass is to combine a risk model. This was work done that Barry did also with Sarah Olam from the World Wildlife Fund. So using soil type, the kind of edge effects, and a few other factors to create a risk of what is the likelihood of this grass pixel being threatened by conversion in the next, I think they used a 5-year time span. Creating that model. So we take that layer and we overlay it with our zonation output, showing where the highest priority is for grassland bird species. And we're able to create this map where we can identify the highest, the grassland areas that are at highest risk of conversion that are also the kind of highest priority, or give you the most bang for your buck in terms of the number of grassland species that would be conserved if those grasslands were protected. And so we have a number of partners, both land trusts and other units within the Canadian Wildlife Service. The stewardship unit is an example, that are using this layer to direct their work. So where they might approach new landowners, and where they may try to target projects for funding. Yeah. All right, so we have all this count data. We have some models and some ways that those are getting used. But more and more partners that we are working with are starting to use ARUs, and we use ARUs for some of our monitoring as well in Southwest Saskatchewan. So that includes all national wildlife areas in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, but there's only one national wildlife area in Manitoba. Use ARUs for their long-term ecological integrity monitoring, and Grasslands National Park also uses ARUs for their long-term bird monitoring as well. So we have these this kind of impetus to be able to properly incorporate ARU data with our in-person data. And we want to do this for a few reasons. ARUs have pros and cons, but a benefit that they have is because we can record over different time periods, and we can do revisits because an ARU is going to be left to record for a week to multiple weeks at a time. And we can record, say, at dusk or at night when there are certain species that may be more vocally active during those periods. We can potentially increase the number of species that we can model effectively. And in any case, by incorporating additional data, especially in more areas that are off-road grassland habitat, like national wildlife areas and Grasslands National Park, we should be able to improve estimates of density and trend as well. So there's many ways to skin the ARU cat is not the right saying, but there's a lot of ways to process ARU data. And we're currently using quite a pragmatic approach to how to integrate the two data types, because we aren't going to leave behind the breeding bird survey and our off-road monitoring. It has been suggested to us before that all bird surveys should be done with ARUs now. And for us, the power of the BBS is more than enough reason that we want to be able to integrate. We want to reduce the bias, appropriately integrate these two data types, and be able to use both ARU data and in-person data in our surveys. So what we did is for 4 or 5 years, we've been schlepping an ARU around on a tripod with us to all of our point counts. And we've been doing these paired recordings. So a recording is going at the exact same time that the in-person count is happening. This is not new. This has already been done for forest birds and for wetland birds, our method for how to integrate them. And it comes off this kind of foundational work, like colloquially known as QPAD, where we're able to kind of use two components of detection probability to kind of standardize data, both in-person data that might be in different survey lengths or different survey radii, but also between ARUs and in-person surveys. I'm not the right person to go into the weeds regardless on the intricacies of QPAD, and it would take an hour in and of itself. But essentially, we're looking at two models that kind of join together. One is for availability, so that's the probability that a bird sings during your count window, and then perceptibility, which is the probability that the observer detects the bird given that it sings, and that is related to the distance the bird is from the observer. So it's a distance model. So we've got these two models, and we're able to use that method to create a correction factor to reduce bias in ARU counts so that we can combine them reliably with in-person data. So we have some problems that our forest friends and our wetland friends did not have. Their paired data showed equal singing rates from the human surveys and the ARU surveys, which makes sense because it's happening at the same time, and you think singing rate, that's a known commodity. The bird singing in one place should be the same whether you're counting on ARU or in person. And the problem is human error, like it usually gets down to, and that's the detection process is influencing our estimate of singing rate. And we'll see an example of what that looks like on the spectrogram in a second. But it essentially means we had to do a little bit more work with our grassland birds to be able to integrate the data. We had to do a little bit more work on the availability model to be able to incorporate the two data sets. Our second problem is that we have a lot more visual detections than in forest or wetlands. This is something that we're still grappling with. Chestnut-colored longspurs is the problem child, and we still haven't found a solution really for integrating the two data types for that species. You'll see in a second. So we use these two models with the paired data set to create a correction factor. And so really quick, the zero line here, we've estimated density for the in-person counts. And now we are looking at the bias for the ARU surveys. So that's a difference in density for ARU surveys where we have that color legend is incorrect. It is actually good. The results are good, not bad. So in blue, we have, if we took our ARU surveys and we just applied the same method as we do with the in-person surveys to get density, no correction factor applied. What is the difference between these paired data sets when we do that? So that's in blue. And then in yellow is after we apply our correction factor, do we see a reduction in bias in the density estimates? And so in some good news, over half of our species, whether you're using the ARU data with or without the correction factor, there's very little difference, and they're very, very close to the human or the in-person estimates. And so that the two survey types are essentially equal for a whole chunk of species. But we have a number of species where we estimated density to be significantly higher when using ARUs as opposed to in-person counts. So Western meadowlark is kind of like off the charts. And our correction factor worked well. We've reduced the bias with confidence intervals overlapping 0. And so we're happy with the results of the correction factor. And most of these species are allowed. And so the ARU is just detecting more than the in-person surveyor. Now, all the birds are in code on the left and small. So you might not pick this out, but the third species that has kind of the highest level of positive bias is the grasshopper sparrow, which is not a loud bird. You may be wondering why. And that's because of that, going back to the differences in how kind of human processing, or how our ability to record birds in the appropriate minute is affected by the two survey types. So in person, grasshopper sparrows are quite faint insect. They can easily kind of blend in with surroundings. You may not detect them until later in the count, even though they could have been going from the beginning. But on the spectrogram, they stick out like a sore thumb. So you have kind of the chaos of the dawn chorus going in this kind of 2 to 6 kilohertz spectral window. And then all our grasshopper sparrows, there's 1, 2, 3, there's probably actually 4 in this clip, 4 individuals alone. And so you can see them stick out right away. And so for someone transcribing an ARU recording, you get all your grasshopper sparrow detections right in the first minute, because you can see them, boom, easy. Whereas down here, you know, there's 4 or 5 different species: chestnut-called longspurs, Baird sparrows, hornlarks, vesper sparrows, western meadowlarks, that are all going at once. And so, but despite whether it's from the availability side or the distance side, how far away the bird is from you, at least for the majority of species, the correction factors are working, at least well enough for our purposes. Then we get down to the bottom here, where we start to see the confidence intervals just exploding, and really, do we have a reliability in combining the 2 data sets for these species? And this is where our visual detections are really coming into play. This group of species down here have a much higher proportion of visual detections on the in-person survey. The ARU is not going to pick up on those. So this is something we're actively grappling with and trying new methods for how to figure out how to kind of appropriately be able to combine ARU data with in-person surveys for these species. We don't want to waste data in the sense of, do we exclude all visual detections from in-person surveys? We lose quite a bit of data that way. And does it get us any closer to our goal? Not really so far. And so we are looking at other options, like call density for these species. So in the ARU, instead of doing the time removal method, could we look at the density of calls, and could that relate more closely to in-person estimated density? So still in the works. Okay, this is the slide that I need to check the time to see. Start at 12:30. So this project I'm going to go a little bit more quickly through, but I wanted to highlight it because this is one of our undergraduate summer technicians. He started working on this project while on staff with us, and then he carried it through to his undergrad research project. And it just highlights another way that kind of all this count data can be used. So this is pulling our point counts. It is integrating the ARU data. And he built models with both of those data sets, using and then looking at a drought index from the North American Drought Monitor. And this is from some observations we made in the field, where there was one season where I think we counted 2 pipits all summer at the sites we were working at. And Barry and I were both running BBS routes with, you know, maybe we'd seen fluctuations. We look back in our data, like, oh man, and it was just, you know, 0 to 1 or 2. It was like a really dramatic decline. And it made us think of a paper that was published in 2018. It's one of the few that's looked at the response of grassland birds to drought at this kind of at the population level scale. So what are the dynamics there? We wondered if are pipits showing any sign of like broader nomadism? You know, is the population going up in another area while it's declining, or while it's dropped so significantly in a given year in another? So yeah, so drought's ranked there from kind of abnormally dry, of course, no drought, to abnormally dry to exceptional drought. And kind of a reason for this project too is we're thinking both implications, we're thinking not primarily maybe, but we're thinking about implications for where we choose to monitor in a given year, how spread out should our sites be. We're doing a kind of a repeat design, right? But you can see that drought in a given year is shifting across the landscape as well. And for our relatively small data set of off-road monitoring, is it going to be, is it going to cause issues with our trend analysis if we happen to survey in an area that's been hit by drought, in year 1 and year 4, but in the meantime, maybe there was low to no drought. And so we're looking at how this might affect how we implement our panel design going forward. And so some preliminary results. So a species that we know to be nomadic, and we know from past research that they are impacted by drought, is the lark bunting. And yes, the model showed that there was a significant negative effect on density for these species. And we can also see a northward shift in the population distribution, depending, well, in this case, northward because of the extent of drought in the southern area of the range. And this matches what's been published previously. But then we were curious about additional species where we don't have published data, and specifically Sprague's pipit. And Sprague's pipit also had a significant effect on density through our data set. Chestnut-colored longspur didn't have a significant effect, but we see this kind of spike, an increased density in when the drought is not too bad, which makes sense for their habitat preferences, which is kind of less litter and more bare ground, which could be improved for them with increasing drought. And then thick-billed longspur also disappeared at the highest level of drought, which we're still digging into because they seem to be have the highest affinity for arid regions. And so that kind of doesn't jive with what we know about their biology. So some promising results. And then we also find species that it's very species dependent, right? And so we have 2 species, grasshopper sparrow and Baird sparrow, that showed no kind of effect on drought sparrow, didn't show any effect to their density. In Baird sparrow's case with the drought severity of 4, we had almost no data for Baird sparrow in drought severity 4. So that's why that kind of drops off there. So we have these species-specific response to drought, and now Josiah, our student who's working on this project, is looking to apply those models and what does it mean under land conversion, but then also under climate change. And so we're expected to see an increase in extreme drought on the prairies. And we are expecting to see continued conversion. And so we think back to how we set priority areas for grassland birds, and we're thinking about how we need to account for the need to have kind of geographically dispersed intact habitat, that focusing just on those core grasslands in southeastern Alberta, southwestern Saskatchewan might be missing the chance to buffer against some of these longer term impacts, where if you have a large drought around an area of grassland, you want additional intact habitat for birds to move to for the species that are adapted to do so. And one way that we could get at that answer as well is with tracking data. So this is kind of the last piece of our grassland bird monitoring puzzle, and that's tracking birds with Motus. So this is new to the program, started in 2022. Motus, for anyone who's not aware, it's a research network that uses radio telemetry. It's made up of 2 components. There's the towers that have VHF or UHF antenna, and a little computer that's able to pick up signals within about 15 kilometers of the station. And then you need tagged animals. And so the kind of benefit of using Motus in this case is that the tags can be made very small, small enough to be put onto some of our target species, small grassland songbirds. And in addition to thinking about within season movement and then how dispersed we would want to have to see grassland habitat, ourselves and partners in the US, this is from Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, have identified these grassland priority conservation areas, and we're interested in seeing the connectivity between these sites. And so that's kind of the impetus for us and a number of different researchers putting out tags on grassland birds in the US, is to kind of connect the dots to see the use between these different sites. All right, and so when Barry started the program, using Motus wasn't an option because the array was very small. So all the yellow dots of the array, early adopter, Christy Morrissey here, kind of representing the few prairie towers there in 2017. But you can see in kind of just a relatively short amount of time, the expansion of the array. And it's kind of expanded enough that we're getting some decent migration tracks. And so to date, we have 5 target species, but we're primarily focused on chestnut-gullet longspurs and Sprague's pipit. There's 241 birds that we've tagged in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and we have about 400,000 detections so far. And this data is also open and freely available. Motus comes with a bunch of caveats for working with the data. For example, we actually have 7.5 million if you downloaded our database detections, but all but 400,000 are ghost detections. So if you're interested in using this data set, please reach out to me and I will give you the clean copy and some other advice. Yeah, so we're tagging Sprague's pipits. We're also tagging Baird sparrow, thick-billed longspur, and horned larks, which are a study species for Nancy Mahoney, who's a partner in the 241 tags include birds that she's tagged at Suffield National Wildlife Area. All right, so some quick preliminary results. So this is the first 3 years of data. We actually have a contractor on right now who is getting into the weeds of some of the first analyses, like larger analyses with these. But kind of 2 results. So this is all the tracks for pipits and longspurs that we have to date. And on the right here is an example of documenting some of that within breeding season movement. So these towers down on the bottom right are from collaboration we have with Dr. Andy Boyce. And so these are pipit tracks. They were tagged in early June. And sometime in mid to late June, there was no nest monitoring done in this project, but the assumption is that there was a failed breeding attempt, and they made a trip up, some stayed around Govan National and Battle Creek. Those are towers that we have in southwest Saskatchewan for the remaining of the summer before they were picked up on southbound migration. And some were detected kind of in passing, so not multiple days of detections near us, but so could have gone even further. So making these 150, 175 kilometer trips during the breeding season is something that had been hypothesized before for pipits, but hadn't been documented with tracking data before. So that kind of gets back to that, the need for this dispersed habitat for some of our grassland species. And I guess what I'll leave off with today is something interesting that we're finding. We see here that a lot of our pipits are dead ending in Kansas, which is not a wintering ground for Sprague's pipits. I think there's only been 5 detections of pipits in Kansas on eBird in the last 10 years. So what's going on here? We also see it. This is a map that has both our tags as well as tags from Matt Webb at Bird Conservancy that tagged a whole bunch of birds down in the Chihuahuan grasslands. And we also see, and this is showing up in the data as well, that a bunch of their tagged birds dead-ended in Kansas. It's not a breeding ground for Sprague's pipits. or chestnut-colored longspurs, or Baird's sparrows. So this is our current mystery, which I don't have a solution for. But we're looking at a bunch of different options, including, is it due to the density of towers kind of south of here? We're looking at different probabilities. It doesn't look any worse in terms of density compared to all these other tracks we have further north. Could it be our harness material? Is it failing? We have a lot of birds that who come on the more westerly route, who make migration back and are detected, you know, all the way back to the breeding grounds, so year round using the same harness material. Yeah, so to be answered. But so far, I think that's kind of the most standout of our migration tracks in terms of kind of the questions of where it's going to lead. All right. Yeah, and none of this is possible without a ton of partners and collaborations on the Grassland Bird Program. It's just Barry and myself, along with 2 to 4 seasonal staff. And so there's all kinds of programs and other organizations where we're kind of working together. And yeah, it's creating these large data sets that are largely publicly available and can really be used in a whole host of different ways. Yeah, so thanks so much for your time, and yeah, happy to take any questions. Yes.
How soon after they were deployed did you pull that data? Do you think there was enough time that all those receivers in the south got rerun since the birds would have hit them?
Yes, we've seen that pattern starting in 2022. So with fewer numbers. But yeah, so I think for the 2024 data, no, it hasn't been long enough to pick up anything further, but and 2023. Yes, yeah, we've repulled. Yeah, no, and we've repulled many times. It is a great question, and it's great for anyone who may be dipping their toes into Motus, that there's many database intricacies, but yeah, we update regularly, and that map is coming from the latest database we've re-downloaded and just in the last few weeks. So, but it is something good to think about.
Think the detection probability varies between your different Motus tag species? So like, are you using different tag sizes, or are there things about their ecology that you would expect it to be more useful for some versus others?
Yeah, another great question. That is something we've been thinking quite a bit about. We're so far mostly choosing our tag types based on weight. For our animal care protocol, we've got a hard 3% limit that includes the band, so it kind of restricts the tag type that we're able to use. But there definitely will be differences between species because we're able to, for hornlarks and thick-billed longspurs, we're able to use solar tags that have a little battery, and so hypothetically they could last for the life of the bird and continue to transmit. They also have tags have a unique signal, but they burst their signal, and the burst interval is different between different tag types. So our solar tags burst every 5 seconds. So the probability that it can be detected by a tower is a lot higher. Whereas our smaller low-tech tags, as the white tag you saw in the chestnut-colored longspur, we use kind of the widest burst interval as possible because we want to make the tag life last as long as possible. So the white tags have a fixed lifespan based on how often they're bursting their signal. So we've got a 30-second burst interval. So you can imagine that that's going to really kind of reduce the detection probability as well. But for Sprague's pipits, we're putting a mix. For heavier pipits, they get the solar tag, and for the skinny pipits, they get the low-tech tag. And we haven't noticed a difference, like both types have been dead ending in Kansas there, for example. So another curiosity, the solar tags are on an ultra high frequency as well, and there's fewer towers that have ultra high frequency antenna. So that's a whole other can of worms for when you're thinking about detection probability with your Motus tags. So there's definitely, yeah, a lot of layers. It's a great question that we have to consider. The maps look pretty, but now that we're actually running the analysis, there's all kinds of things that we have to consider before we can really draw real conclusions. Yeah.
On the CCC solar tags, there can also be variation in detection probability based on how much sun the tag is.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, and we thought they were a good candidate. And like for, I can't remember what was it, cuckoo study where then it's like, oh, where the cuckoo's winter, there's like deep brush with no sun, so it's not going to work. But for our grassland birds, we think that, but it could be true like Baird sparrows or certain species might spend more time like in denser cover, and so yeah, that's definitely a good point to consider as well.
Question. Correction factor on your ARUs. Are you envisioning that the correction factor would be species specific then based on your data set? And I realize there's some that are, there's a visual problem, like the problem of being more affected visually, but all the other ones above, like your sort of the top part of the graph, is that then the goal to have a correction factor for each individual species? And is that essentially how you're going to ultimately use it?
Yeah, the correction factors are species specific, but our paired data set was collected across like a pretty large geographic area within BCR 11. So they can be, we don't recommend applying a correction factor because to like a savanna sparrow, like the Ipswich savanna sparrow, we wouldn't apply our savanna sparrow correction to like a different population of the same species, but they can be applied to work within BCR 11. Our correction factors that we've already estimated could be used by any other project, and they're also, yeah, freely available and will be published very soon as well.
Okay, I think that's
Cool.
all we have time for.
Okay,
So let's put
awesome.
up one more time.